It's a privilege for me to be here. I'll be speaking in English, of course, but if there are questions in Portuguese, well, I'll answer in Portuguese, of course. I think that's will be no problem. And I'm really privileged for this invitation with these two young curators. I've been very privileged because, in fact, I've been working with young curators that, in fact, are changing the canon of art in the West. And I have done that abroad. I've done that at Pompidou in Paris with Le Peuple qui Manque, a group of young curators. Then in Berlin, and also the Haus der Kultur der Welt. In Barcelona, Alex Abuali, and now in Porto. So I'm very pleased to come home to my country and to discuss with you the topic of my talk, which will be the extent to which art and the artists can contribute to the epistemology of the South. Some of you may not be very familiar with this concept of the epistemology of the South, and therefore I'll start by that, by explaining a little bit what are the epistemologies of the South, and we'll go from there. But first about our context. I think there is a sense of political exhaustion in the West, or in the global North, if you prefer. A sense of political exhaustion, of theoretical exhaustion. We see all over the rise of social inequality, the rise of fascism, the rise of colonialism, and the forms of racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia. We see the rise of patriarchy in forms of sexism and heterosexism. We see this fact, which is really, from another perspective, quite an horror in Goya's terms, that the 8 wealthiest people in the world have as much wealth as the poor half population of the world, 3.5 billion people. How come? What kind of world is this? This sense of exhaustion is something that is lived through in the global North, but not in the same way in the global South. There are lots of alternatives, lots of discussions, lots of struggles and resistance, difficult resistance. I'm just today, my heart is very heavy today, as I have just listened to the news coming from my friends in Brazil of a military intervention in the state of Rio. For the first time after the 1988 constitution, we have a military government in one of the states of Brazil. Could be the initial phase of a new dictatorship? Nobody knows. But in any case, it shows that democracy at the core is in crisis. Why is that? What is happening in the world? It is very interesting that since we are at the beginning of the 21st century, it is interesting to compare with the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time, there were lots of problems. In fact, social science, sociologists particularly, they are born at that time because there is a social question. There's tremendous problems, social problems, health problems, crime, prostitution, sanitation, all kinds of problems because of the rise of capitalism, the first industrial revolution. But there are two models of social transformation. That is to say, there are lots of problems, but there are two different, very different actually, but two different models of a future society. Moving forward, changing that society into a different one. And these two models were social revolution and social reform. And in fact, the socialist camp, or if you like, the people that were not satisfied with society at the time, they were very much divided between those that thought that democracy could bring about a socialist society, so democratic reformism, democratic socialism, as it was called then, and then social revolution. That was a kind of an interruption of the capitalist order. And, of course, the Russian Revolution is on the horizon. Well, the artists at that time, they go through this process and they live it intensely. They are not revolutionaries, but they live the atmosphere of the time, which is divided in these two models. What is the contrast with our situation today? Is that at the beginning of the 21st century, we have neither of these two models of progress, of emancipation of a better society. Social revolution is not in the agenda, and social reformism is not in the agenda either in many countries. Probably Portugal at this point has a small hope with the government that we have at this point. Finally, I like to give good news about my own country. Usually I have no good news to give. But social reformism everywhere, in Europe, in Africa. Look at what's happening today in South Africa, Brazil, as I said, Latin America, Argentina. Neither social reformism nor social revolution. So there are no paradigms of social transformation, of progressive social transformation. Here, therefore, a sense of paralysis. How do the artists go through that? How can we really account for this and get out of here, basically? As a critical thinker, I think that we have to find ways of getting out. And here, and since Sophia and Alessandra mentioned Karl Marx, I'd like to say that what I've been struggling in my work is to produce a new Thesis 11. I don't know if you are familiar with the Thesis 11. The young Marx wrote a small piece, a short piece, about Feuerbach. Ludwig von Feuerbach, which at the time was the great philosopher, materialistic philosopher in Germany. And but it was really a kind of another thinking with no social transformation inside of that thinking. So Marx, in the 11th thesis, says that the philosophers have been trying to understand the world. But what we need is to transform the world. And that's the famous 11th thesis. I think that we need a new Thesis 11. We need a new comprehension of the world before we transform it. We need a new understanding of the world before we're changing it. And this new understanding means that we are at a point in which we need an epistemological rupture or interruption, if you like. And why is that so? Because as politics in our time today seems to give no alternative. Well, look at the newspapers. Look at our media. I mean, if there is an election, the stock markets were happy or the stock markets were unhappy. There is no word about the citizens, but about the markets. There's a change of politics in South Africa. The rand went up. Very good news. Lula is condemned. The real goes up. What sense does it make in a democracy that in fact is the value of money and the reaction of stock markets that really command the legitimacy of governments? So if this line of thought, this political thought, seems so epistemological because there is no alternative, that's what neoliberalism is telling us. We have to be entrepreneurs. That is to say, obsessive and possessive individualists. Because since we know that nobody can, not all people can win at the same time, for me to win, you have to lose. But that's the principle. Possessive individualism and egotism. Is this our culture today? I think we need an epistemological interruption. Before I address the question, that the artists at the beginning of the century, the 20th century, they were not revolutionaries, of course, but they were aware. Some of them were, of course. The Russian constructivists, for instance. But others were not. Picasso, Matisse, for instance. But they were very much aware of the ferment, the atmosphere of the time. And therefore, they were responding by their struggle at the time, which was the struggle against naturalism. They were really trying to bring forward a new art that would be more responsive to the needs of the new society that is about to start. The idea of the beginning We are at 1 century later, at beginning of an end, and there is no beginning after that in sight. There is an interregnum. And some of you may be familiar with Gramsci. When Gramsci speaks about the interregnum, he says it's a time of monsters. And in fact, there are lots of monsters in our time. In the dialogue, I can really bring about in the discussion. But now, I would like to move forward to the epistemology of the South. The epistemology of the South is a set of procedures that to try to give credibility and validate the knowledge born in struggle against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. It's knowledge produced from the perspectives of those that have been suffering the systematic injustices, discriminations, and exclusions caused by capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And here, as you can see, there is a difference in relation to Marx, if you like. Is that I think that these three modes of domination work together. And they cannot exist one without the other. It has been quite wrong for the social sciences to think that colonialism was over because the European colonies were become independent. No. Colonialism continued under new forms. It's not coloniality, as my colleague Quijano mentions, or Mignolo. No, it's not coloniality. It's colonialism under different forms. So we live in colonial societies. We live in patriarchal societies. And we live in capitalist societies. And what is the problem of our age? Is that domination works together. Capitalism together with colonialism, together with patriarchy. While the resistance against this domination is separated. Some struggle against capitalism, trade unions. Others struggle against colonialism, black movements, Afro-descendant movements. Others struggle against patriarchy, women's movement, feminist movements. And they are separated. Because if they struggle against patriarchy, some of them care about capitalism, others don't. Many do not care about colonialism. And vice versa, it applies to all of them. Domination operates united, resistance resists separately. And that's why it's so divided. So I think that we have to bring them together through this idea that modern knowledge is a knowledge that has prevented us to recognize and to validate the knowledge of those that resist against this environment, those that resist the struggle and those that suffer. We can speak sometimes about them, we can speak with them, but it's not their voice, even though they have a voice, but they are not heard. Therefore, the epistemology of the South is this attempt to bring forward all the knowledge that had been silenced, suppressed, excluded, not even considered knowledge. It has been considered superstition, opinions, subjectivities, but not rigorous knowledge. And try to bring it to the surface, not to say that it's the only valid knowledge. No, science is also valid. But the conversation of humankind needs all kinds of knowledges. We have to allow different knowledges to engage in a broader conversation of the humanity. Because if I want to go to the moon, I need scientific knowledge. But if I want to know the biodiversity of Amazonia, I need indigenous knowledge. I need different knowledges for different purposes. And therefore, all of them should be brought into conversation. Not to say that all of them are valid the same way, not at all. Depends on your objectives. Depends on what you are up to. So I think to bring this forward against what? Against what I call epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge. We have destroyed. The Western thinking has destroyed, and I would include Marxism in this, has destroyed all kinds of traditions, other alternative ways of knowing, that incomplete pasts that we didn't allow to flourish in their own terms. In my own research, I work with indigenous people in Latin America and can tell you the wisdom that comes out of those populations and why that wisdom cannot be heard. It's not really validated by us because we have been suppressing. They are not knowers in our sense. So the epistemology of the South comes from this basic argument that societies continue divided between two societies that are facing each other but don't see each other. The metropolitan societies and the colonial societies. Now they are not societies, they are forms of sociability. There's a metropolitan sociability. The metropolitan sociability is the sociability where there are rights, where there are human rights, general principles, universal principles, social, civil society, and there is the colonial sociability. The sociability of those that we consider subhumans. Women have been for a long time considered subhuman. Black people have been considered subhuman, and they still are. That's why Black Lives Matter today in the United States. Because they don't matter. Because they're not really human. So I think that our societies are divided up till now. So there are people in our societies, there are two types of exclusion. Social science have not seen this. The non-abyssal, because this is an abyssal line that divides these two societies, and they don't see each other. They are incommensurable. When colonialism started, for instance, all the principles, for instance, the Portuguese and Spaniards divided the world. All the principles of human rights of the church at the time were to be valid in this area, in this metropolitan area. In the colonial area, that was completely different. That was a different era. For instance, piracy, the Portuguese and the Spaniards collaborate with pirates on the other side, even though it was forbidden on this side. Two societies, the divide was absolute and abyssal, because it's radical and we don't see each other. We don't see this abyssal line. Particularly in our time, after the end of colonialism, you think that everybody is now one world. It is not one world. And I'll give you examples of this. So the abyssal divide is still there in our societies. A woman, and to tell you what I mean by this abyssal society, I start with an example. A woman that works in a restaurant in Oporto. Of course, she may be non-abyssally excluded. She lives in a metropolitan society, and therefore she may suffer exclusion, but she has rights. For instance, the normal exclusion is that she performs the same work, but the pay is inferior to the man's pay. So for the same pay, less, for the same work, less pay. So this is a form of exclusion. But this woman, when she goes home, she may be assassinated by the partner. If she's in India, she may be victim of a gang rape. If she's in Mexico, she may be victim of feminicide. When she becomes victim of that, she has no rights at that point. She's not a human being, in full human being, for those that attack her, for the aggressors. She is subhuman. That is to say, she crossed the abyssal line between the metropolitan society and the colonial society. And the same happens with the worker. The Moroccan worker or Algerian worker that works in Paris in the restaurant. Of course, he's also excluded very often in the restaurant because he also works as much as the French friend or colleague, but doesn't get as much pay. So there are exclusions, but there are labor rights, there are protections in that society. But this same person, when he crosses the street, she may be put in prison without any warrant because he's suspect of terrorism. He may be attacked, a woman may be attacked because he's a jihadist or a jihadist, because it is suspect of being a radical Islamist. And that can be destroyed, can be eliminated without rights. Look at Guantanamo. Are there rights in Guantanamo? No, because the people that are there are not really human. They are dangerous subhuman entities. Ghosts, in a sense. So I think that our societies are divided in these two forms of exclusion, the abyssal and the non-abyssal. We live in the protected society, the non-abyssal exclusion. But many of our refugees, immigrants, particularly non-documented immigrants, they don't live in the protected society. They want probably to come here, of course, for very good reasons, but they are excluded from that. And sometimes it is not a different territory, it's our territory, it's our society today. Greece and Italy, the borders of Greece of Italy now are the Mali, are the Republic of Congo, are Sudan. So it's not the Mediterranean Ocean. The borders have changed because the people that come at the borders come from these countries. The contiguous border among countries is collapsing. You know, the Costa Rican at this point has a border with Haiti, has a border with Mali, has a border with Nigeria. Because given, in view of the policy, European policy for refugees, many of the refugees are moving to Costa Rica to try to enter the United States. So the refugees are there at the entrance, at the southern border of Costa Rica. So Costa Rica, all of a sudden, have people from Africa at our borders, its borders. So this is the world in which we are living, a world divided between people that are fully human and are relatively protected in spite of everything, and people that are not really fully human. They are considered subhuman. It is not a question of the past. We don't feel it, probably in this auditorium, in our societies, but we have to conceive our societies as a very protected, small world. When our social sciences were developed, 94% of the world was European. They were either colonies or land under the influence of Europe. Europe has shrunk. It's very small now, and the world is expanding. In 30 years' time, China will account for 50% of the world trade. The Western world is shrinking, and the non-Western world is growing and emerging. Is it a good sign? Could be a disaster, could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. That's the point of bifurcation at which we are now. And I think that we have to understand this radical diagnosis of our time in order to understand why so many people are killed, everyone in our cities. Can you imagine that in Brazil, more people were assassinated by the police? 95% young black kids, youth in Brazil, more people than in Syria. Even though Syria is at war and Brazil is in peace. Look at the United States. I live 5 months of my time. For the past 30 years, I live for 5 months in the United States. And I can see this transformation. How much violence is going on the streets of the cities. Sometimes it's very chaotic. See, last week or a few days in Florida. We don't know how this violence, but somehow the idea of subhuman humanity, there are people that are not fully human, so they are not, cannot be belong to us. They belong to them. They are something different. So I think what strikes me most at this world is that after so many centuries of enlightenment, of our human rights, we still divide our societies between human beings and subhuman beings. People that are not fully human, therefore they don't deserve to be protected. If we really see what's happening to the refugees, what is happening in the camps, this is not to be treated like a human being. It's something else. That's why if 2 or 3 people are killed in Paris, it's a disaster. But if hundreds of people, thousands of people are killed in Yemen, nobody talks about that. They are not really human in the same way as we are. So This idea brings me to the concept. I don't have time to go into that because I just stressed this first part because of the artists. I'll come to the artists in a moment. But just to say from this, I developed 4 key concepts in the epistemology of the South. The sociology of absences is that the difficulty that you have to recognize that this reality exists is we resist against this. How come that there are people subhuman among us? So that's the sociology of absences. Things that are negated, invisible, suppressed. And we don't see them because we produce them as invisible. Then the sociology of emergencies. That once we start to see that on the other side of the line, in the colonial sociability, there are things that are happening. People are resisting. People are having new ideas, innovating things. Can we imagine that the indigenous people now in Ecuador are giving us a lesson for the future? These peoples that were almost destroyed by colonialism, they come up with a concept that now the young kids around the world are buying enthusiastically. The idea of the Pachamama, the idea of the Mother Earth, the idea that nature does not belong to us, we belong to nature. That the distinction between nature and society does not exist. It is a Cartesian artifact for capitalism to develop in the colonies, to plunder the colonial territories. Nature is us. Because there is no nature without human nature. There is no human nature without nature. Who is telling us this? Who has put in the constitution of a country like Ecuador, Article 71, that nature has rights? The indigenous people. The most excluded people in modernity. The ones that are on the other side of the line, they have never counted as the colonized people. Even Marxism never looked at them. A great Peruvian Marxist, José Carlos Mariátegui, once said, well, the sin of Latin America is that it was created without the Indian and against the Indian. Can you imagine this guy was almost killed by the communists from Moscow? The Comintern came from Moscow to Lima to tell him, you are crazy, you are a romantic. The only revolutionary class is the working class. Indigenous people are residual of the past, a residue of the past. What are you thinking? Are you crazy? Well, under Stalinism, to be considered romantic, as you know, was really probably the severest accusation. That's what happened to Trotsky in 1942. Well, it so happened that this guy was a very fragile guy, was very sick, and he died when he was 42 years of age. Otherwise, I think Mariátegui probably would be eliminated because he was romantic. So these people are telling us something that is absolutely important for us to solve the climate change, to solve our environmental crisis, a different conception of our being in nature, with nature, in the web of life. The web of life cuts across nature and human nature, of course. Where is this lesson coming from? Many people would say, well, this is an indigenous idiosyncrasy. Well, now, you cannot say that when you look at the ecological disaster of the world. I had the privilege of being the president of an ethical court in Quito to protect an international tribunal to protect the Yatsuni, probably the largest national park with the most of the biodiversity in the world. And which were the people giving testimony to the court, to the tribunal, in favor of this park. Were not just indigenous people, were young kids, young youth, urban kids that don't know anything about indigenous culture, do not know Quechua or Aymara. They have never been in Amazonian region, but resonates to them the concept of nature as Mother Nature, as something to which we belong instead of belonging to us. So I think that it is this epistemological interruption that we need at the time. Another understanding of the world, the new 11, thesis 11, as I was saying. So, and these are the emergencies. I give you, after probably a disturbing diagnosis of the abyssal line, I can give you the sociology of emergencies, what is emerging. And what is emerging is that we are not demonizing, and here is my specificity of the type of approach that I'm trying to propose with my team at Centros de Estudos Sociais, is that it is not to say demonizing science or modern science. No. We need science. But we need science as an ecology of knowledges. That is to say, science is not the only valid knowledge. It has to collaborate with other knowledges. And we see that when we are in struggle. For instance, now I'm participating in a struggle in Brazil against the toxic products in the agriculture. As you know, Brazil is the largest consumer of toxic insecticides, pesticides that are very toxic and very dangerous for human life. You know, a strawberry, for instance, 19% of content, of dangerous content, in 19% of the production, we see there very dangerous residues of toxic waste, toxic products. So they are really poisoning us. Well, in that struggle is very interesting. There are two sciences, and that's why I come very close to Donna Haraway, what we call the internal pluralism of science. There is one science that is absolutely against us. Is the science that is funded by Monsanto, the great firm of pesticides. Those scientists say, well, there is no danger, glyphosate. Now Europe is entering this treaty with Canada, as you know, is to allow us to force us in Europe to get those products with that poison, because it's allowed in the United States, through Canada, come from the United States, and we are going to have it in our meat, in the meat that you are going to consume. That's what it is at stake. So I think that the science is absolutely against us. But there is scientists, agronomers, engineers, biologists that are with us, that really confirm that it's poisonous. And this knowledge articulates with the peasant knowledge, because the peasants in Brazil, they know very well that it's poisonous, because they feel that in their lungs. Can you imagine that a peasant in northeast Brazil, the incidence of lung cancer is higher than in São Paulo? In the countryside, in the most pure atmosphere of the countryside, because of the poison, because, you know, these agrotoxic products are dispersed through airplanes. And with the wind, it goes into the schools, into the communities, and into the lungs, into the water, poisoning. So I think that this science is with us, the one that fights with us. And of course we value the knowledge of the peasants, ecology of knowledges. And then there is a concept, and I'm very brief, which is the intercultural translation, which is very important, because how can I translate the concept of Pachamama, an indigenous concept, in the concept of nature, which is the Cartesian concept, in which says that nature is res extensa. Only human beings have the divine privilege of the creation. It's a very special creation, the human beings. Nature is inert, it's res extensa. We are res intensa. But we have done that because, of course, res extensa was the way of plundering the natural resources of Latin America. And that's why the indigenous people were considered nature. They were not considered really human beings. Only in 1537, the Pope declared that they had soul. And the declaration is completely egotistic. Because if they have no soul, they cannot be converted to Christianity. So they have to grant them soul. So finally, they accept that they have a soul. So it is what is inferior is always natural. That's why women has always been considered closer to nature. Because whatever is closer to nature is inferior in our culture. Well, the other knowledges bring us a completely different. And if you take Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, comes very close to the same conclusion. So what is exceptional is the universal concept, Western-centric concept of nature. In fact, is universal? No, it's very exceptional when you look at the world as a broad landscape. So I think that it is this epistemological rupture that we need to understand our current time. I move now to the second part of my talk. We see what to do. We have the arts to do with this. Can they save us? Can they do something for us? I think so. I think so. Quite frankly, I have to tell you, I'm a tragic optimist. I'm never a pessimist. I mean, I'm an intellectual, but I'm also an activist. And I work with social movements. And those that work with social movements cannot afford to be pessimists or cynics. We have to engage with people that are alive today, and tomorrow they may be dead. They feed their children today, but tomorrow maybe they have no food for their children. We cannot afford to be cynical. People are struggling for survival. Many people, millions of people in the world, as I speak. How many children have been just dying while I started my conversation with you? Well, first of all, art. Well, art as an institution, as we know as art, is abyssal art. That is to say, this art has been produced on the metropolitan side. All our theories, our institutions, our galleries, our museums, our certifications of art, they have been produced on metropolitan society with due respect of other conceptions of art. On the other side of the line, the colonial side, because it does not count. Can we say that there is some hope for art? Yes, there is. Because we have to distinguish between art as an institution, as a canon, as a certified museum, and the artist and the arts as a practice. Because the artist exceeds the institutions. I don't exceed social sciences. An artist can be unmanageable. And they have been very much unmanageable. And I'm going to give you some examples. Because as an institution, there is not much hope. I mean, look, I give you two examples in which you can see how the abyssal line has been working in the realm of arts. Everybody here, I think most people here probably are familiar with the arts. So everybody knows about primitivism. Can you imagine a more Eurocentric name for a current in art as primitivism? It designates the moment in which particularly the young artists of the School of Paris, and most prominently Picasso and Matisse, before them Gauguin, are going to resort to African art to escape from naturalism. We call this the fact that they have to resort to Africa as a kind of a primitivism. While the art, the African art that they were collecting, that's why Picasso liked it, was highly sophisticated, highly abstract, highly stylized, that was not natural. How come that this art came to their attention? Through colonialism. This art from Africa arrives in Paris after the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, in which the colonial powers, European colonial powers, did the first scramble for Africa. They divided Africa. And as a byproduct of the colonial plunder, African art started to arrive in Paris. Remember, it is 1913 that Nefertiti is traveling from Egypt to Berlin. It's the same period. So it's part of the colonial plunder, this art arrives in Paris. But it is art? No. Because our abyssal concept of art, that is to say, produced in the metropolitan society, these are arts and crafts, craftwork, artisans. They were sold at a very cheap price in Paris because they were not really art. But Matisse and Picasso knew what they were trying to see. And they did a revolution based on that. So I think that this shows that these guys were trying, these painters were trying to what? To be post-abyssal. What I'm defending here is the idea of a post-abyssal art. There is an art that recognizes that there is this abyssal line that divides metropolitan sociability, the relevant sociability, and the colonial sociability, the irrelevant sociability, the sociability of the subhumans, those that really do not count. And what I want to defend is precisely this. But I'll give you another example so that you'll know. Everybody knows here what is batik, right? This way of dyeing fabric through wax, because wax is repellent to the dyeing, and therefore produce the batik, the new art form. But was it an art form in the beginning? Originating from Java, then moving to Africa, and then moving to Caribbean? No, it was arts and crafts. It was not an art. Are the Caribbean women, writers and artists, that are going to transform a craft into an art. And today batik is, if you go to Caribbean, any museum, they have the art there, yes. But the women had to transform this craft into art. They crossed the abyssal line. They crossed the abyssal line. They denied the idea that this on the colonial side has no relevance for our art. And they transform it into a kind of an art. So I think that these two examples allow you to see that, in fact, today, from the beginning, we have seen this struggle, and therefore, the art has been abyssal in all its nature, but it has a vocation to be post-abyssal. And the artist, the rebellious artists, and I'll give you some examples, are the ones that are pointing to this post-abyssal world. The world in which to recognize the abyssal line and struggles against it, fights against this exclusion. That's an example of museums. Museums is the best example of abyssal art. Because the museums, the conventional museums, are based on a double negation. They store whatever is relevant, but they are the selection about the relevancy. And therefore it looks like that whatever is relevant is there. Because there is a huge selection of those things that were not considered relevant. But if you look at museums today, that's why these young curators are so important. They are transformed the idea of the archive, the idea of the museum. We have already even a name for that, social museology. We have a name for this, and I distinguish in my work two types of museums: the palimpsest museum and the insurgent museum. The palimpsest is those that are really populated the museums with the ghosts of slavery, the ghosts of colonialism, the ghosts of patriarchy, whatever has been suppressed. That's why I was a while ago in Cucuta, on the border between Colombia and Venezuela, invited by the artist, Alex Brahim, that were trying to build a beautiful art project called Juntos Aparte. That's a beautiful name. Juntos Aparte, because with artists from one side and from the other side. And they were in fact trying to do an insurgent archive, a palimpsest, I mean. But then there is insurgent archive, which is the archive of the ephemeral, of the streets, of the people in the favelas of Brazil, in the banlieues of Paris, that they are building new museums. Street life, street art, forms of new museums based on the quality of these museums. They are based on non-stolen products, objects. Most of our museums, in the past particularly, were stolen products. These are not. For instance, I know very well, and you can know more, about the Museu da Maré. Museu da Maré is a large favela in Rio. They have a beautiful museum built by the community, with the things that have been around in the community, and there they are transforming their own museum to create self-esteem, to create a representation of the world as their own. Most people don't represent the world as their own. They represent the world owned by others because they are just consumers. They're just commodities. We have to be producers of the world in order the world to be our own and to transform it. So I think that this possibility of the insurgency is very much present in the art. And I can give you some examples of artists, and here is very interesting, because that's different from the social sciences, I think, is that there are two types of artists that I'm putting together. It's a new book that's not out yet, but in which I've been working, is that the artist may be working on both sides of society, either on metropolitan or the colonial side. The artists on the colonial side are not certified as artists in the metropolitan side. They are certified otherwise, by their communities, by their people. Look at Oaxaca, Mexico, 2006. The street art of Oaxaca, the graffiti are absolutely extraordinary, by fabulous artists, never recognized as art. But they are art for the community. So you have the metropolitan artists can also work here, in Porto, in Coimbra, in the protected society, and be post-abyssal, because it goes to the margins and shows the idea of the abyssal line. And when they go to the margins, they live to be marginal. I'm very much against the idea of marginality. We are not. The people that are trying to innovate are not marginal. They are frontier people. They are beyond, not at the margins. So I'll give you two examples, very brief examples, of what I mean by that. First of all, certified artists in metropolitan. Well, I cannot have much time, I have to finish, but I want to give you two examples. The first one is by Gilles Montecorvo, The Battle of Algiers, Batalha de Argélia. I don't know if you have seen that movie, 1966. It's a fabulous movie because it shows the abyssal line, the two worlds in Argel, the European quarter and Kasbah. They don't meet, they don't talk, they don't know each other. It's interesting that when this film came out, nobody noticed that the Islamic religion was very important in the movie, because at the time nobody looked at the Islam. Now everybody looking at the Islam, and you know this film, how is it so popular? Because it's shown both at the Pentagon, the guys that are fighting against terrorism, and one of the critics just said, this could look like a recruiting film for Al-Qaeda. The same film. Because it shows two worlds that do not communicate. So I don't have image of that, I wouldn't have time. But I have time of an artist, which is Paci. Adrie Pacis is Albanian. And you can see how this art, there are 3 stills of a video, and you'll see very clearly how Paci shows the idea of the abyssal line. Here's a group of people going a stairways, a movement, that's a still of the... Then we are going to see where they are going, here. And they stay there. This piece is called Centro de Temporânea de Permanência Contemporânea. They are there. Look at this. The abyssal line. Are they in prison? No. They are a vast field, absolutely open. The metropolitan society is in the airplane, symbolized. That's the metropolitan society. They are in the colonial society. See the exclusion, the abyssal exclusion? This video is a 6-minute video and shows the power of the images in art. So I could go on, but I don't have time because I want to give you the other examples are the non-certified artists, certified otherwise. The artists that come and then they struggle for certification. The examples are various in my work. I start with the black gospel and the blues, the reggae, one time. Today, the hip-hop, the rap. I work with rappers, not only in Portugal, but also in Brazil. The rappers, the graffiti, the breakdance, the DJs. These are people that are producing art on the other side of the line. We work with the people in Cova da Moura. The most important, in my view, rappers of Portugal come from Cova da Moura. Both men and women rappers. And you can see in the rapper the abyssal line very clearly. And one thing that is very amazing for me and really devastating for me is that this exclusion, this abyssal line, degrades both the metropolitans and Cologne, degrades us, because they exist. They are not just the victims that are degraded as humans. It's that on the mirror. We are also subhuman. And here I just give you the example of Kendrick Lamar. I don't know if you know Kendrick Lamar, just won the Grammy in 2012, 18. He's one of the greatest rappers today and really fabulous rapper. Look at this, just at this piece, little short piece of Lamar. Who am I? Not your father, not your brother, not your reason, not your future, not your comfort, not your reverence, not your glory, not your heaven, not your angel, not your spirit, not your message, not your freedom, not your people, not your neighbor, not your baby, not your equal, not the title you all want me under, all you hail, killmonger, red light, green light, red light, green light, red light, green light, they like, we like fast cars. Look at this, we like fast cars. We also like Grammys. That is to say, we are so different, abyssal line. And we are both degraded that we really, jointly, together, we like the same degraded object, a fast car. So this is what the artists are telling us. And my very last example was the Samba de Enredo of Tuiuti, the favela from Rio, Paraíso, and the favela that came with, they were the vice president in these marches of Carnival, and today is really showing the limits of the social sciences. While the politicians are still struggling about resistance, these people have been working to produce the most devastating critique of the current government in Brazil with a very simple question. God, is there still slavery? And this is a rhetorical question, because of course there is, for them. It was fabulous, because it's art at the core, but the same denunciation. So I conclude by telling you that in my view today, artists are probably the only competent rebels of our time. I think social scientists, we have been rebels. I consider myself a rebel, but I guess that sometimes I'm incompetent. I think these people, not for a long time. Then they get a Kendrick Lamar, may happen to him what happened to Kanye West and others. But they really are at that time, for a while, they are competent rebels. Why do they do that? Because art can do something that we don't do. As they maximize at the same time fear and hope. Those images by Pace are really the despair, the critique, the fear of not being human on top of those stairways, and the world is close to them. Probably the only airplane that they can get is the deportation plane back to their country. At the same time, the dignity of these people as humans before us, that the artists bring to us. So artists are competent rebels. Thank you very much.